Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our devotion time. This morning we're in Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 11, and we're going to examine the religious leaders' plot to kill Jesus and how Judas actually helps them to that end. So take a look at verse 1 of Mark chapter 14 with me. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, Passover was Friday night, and so this is sometime on Wednesday. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." Now, these leaders want to have Jesus dead before Friday night so that they can enjoy the Passover without Jesus ruining it for them. The only thing stopping them from killing Jesus is the crowds. We've already mentioned in previous videos that the crowds were protecting Jesus. They absolutely loved him. They believed that he was the Messiah. And so the religious leaders had to be very careful in how they dealt with Jesus when they were in these large group settings. So how are they going to get this accomplished? Well, we're going to skip verses 3 through 9 at this point. We'll come back to them in a moment. But for right now, let's look down at verse 10. Remember, the religious leaders are trying to attack Jesus when he's away from the crowds, and to do that, they have to figure out where Jesus is going to be so that they can set an ambush. Now, obviously, these religious leaders don't have access to Jesus' itinerary, so how are they going to figure out where Jesus is going to be? Well, let's look at verse 10 to find out. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray Jesus to them. When they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And Judas sought an opportunity to betray Jesus to them. Now, Judas knows that the religious leaders are going to have to find a time when Jesus is alone, and he offers to assist them in finding that time. He knows that Jesus is going to want to eat the Passover meal privately with his disciples, and he figures that would be the perfect time to arrest Jesus. All Judas has to do now is find out where and when that will be and bring that news back to the religious leaders so that they can set an ambush. In exchange for Judas's services, the leaders offer to pay him handsomely. But why would Judas want to betray Jesus, a man whom he knew was innocent? Sure, Judas was greedy, and 30 pieces of silver sounded like a great deal to him, but doesn't it seem like it would have to be more than that? Well, it was. And Mark inserts verses 3 through 9 between the Pharisees' plot to kill Jesus and Judas's offer to help to show us the reason why Judas betrayed him. Mark wants us to see that Judas is trying to get back at his master for something that had happened several days earlier. This flashback in verses 3 through 9 takes us to Saturday night in a small town called Bethany, the night before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead in this same town of Bethany several weeks earlier, and now the townspeople want to throw a huge feast to show their support for Jesus, their Messiah. We can check it out in verse number 3. While Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster box of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over Jesus' head. Now there were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. So let's talk about this feast for just a moment. It was held in the house of a man called Simon the leper. Now, we don't know exactly who this guy is, but apparently he's someone that Jesus healed earlier in his ministry. Although Mark simply notes that a woman came, John lets us know that it was actually Lazarus' own sister who was named Mary. Mary comes into the feast and she breaks this box open and she pours this pure ointment on Jesus's head, and John notes even on his feet as well. Now, this ointment would have come in a sealed bottle that Mary had to break open in order to anoint Jesus with it. This lavish gesture would have cost her over 300 denarii, which was a day's wage in the first century. That's about $20,000 in today's economy. Mark records that there were some who were angry about this, and John gives us a little bit more detail and notes that Judas is actually the one stirring up the crowd against Mary. Judas mentions wanting to give this money to the poor, but he does so not because he was a generous man, but because he was greedy and wanted to get his hands on some of those proceeds. Now, Jesus is not about to let Judas get away with this. Check out what he says in verse 6. And Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why are you troubling her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memorial of her." Now, Jesus is here defending Mary while at the same time publicly exposing Judas in front of this large crowd. This incident would prove to be the straw that broke the camel's back for Judas. For a long time, he's been dissatisfied with Jesus' lack of political aspiration and political action in establishing his kingdom. And now Judas has determined it's time to put Jesus in his place. That's why Judas offers to betray him to the religious leaders. It wasn't completely about the money. It was about teaching Jesus a lesson for humiliating Judas that Saturday night. Meanwhile, Jesus continues to prepare to eat the Passover meal with his disciples. He's not about to let anything stop him from accomplishing his Father's mission. And tomorrow we'll find out exactly how he does that. God bless and have a great day.